How does a place known across the world for its stark beauty and geological permanence appear to vanish within weeks? How can a coastline visited by tens of thousands each year seem to dissolve into the sea without warning, leaving behind confusion, speculation, and a flood of unanswered questions? And perhaps most unsettling of all, was it truly gone? Or was something far more complex unfolding beneath the surface? Along the southern coast of Iceland, a stretch of shoreline long defined by its deep black sands and relentless waves drew global attention as reports began circulating that one of its most recognizable landscapes had effectively disappeared. Visitors arriving in the early weeks of the year encountered a scene that did not match photographs, travel guides, or even recent memories. Where there had once been a broad, walkable expanse of volcanic sand, there was now only a narrow, steep edge pressed tightly against jagged cliffs, with waves surging far beyond their usual reach. This location, widely known for its towering basalt formations and offshore rock pillars rising from the Atlantic, had built its reputation on both accessibility and raw natural power. Under normal conditions, the shoreline offered a relatively wide buffer zone between visitors and the ocean. The sand, composed of finely ground volcanic material, stretched outward in a dark, textured plain, occasionally interrupted by scattered stones and polished fragments carried in by waves. The basalt columns, arranged in striking geometric patterns, stood as one of the most photographed features, easily reachable during calmer tides. Nearby coastal caves, carved over centuries by wave action, added another layer of attraction, particularly during periods of low water. As recently as late autumn of the previous year, the area remained in this expected state. The beach was stable, its boundaries familiar, and its features accessible. Foot traffic followed predictable paths, and the relationship between land and sea appeared balanced, if not entirely calm. Seasonal fluctuations were understood, but nothing indicated an impending transformation of this magnitude. The first signs of change began to appear as winter advanced. By December, increased storm activity across the North Atlantic had begun to alter conditions along the coast. Waves grew more forceful, driven by sustained wind patterns that intensified their reach and impact. The shoreline, once broad and gently sloping, started to narrow. Areas that had remained dry even during higher tides were now being overtaken by surging water. At this stage, the changes, while noticeable, did not yet signal a complete transformation. Visitors still arrived, though some reported reduced access to certain sections. The basalt columns, typically approached with ease, were occasionally surrounded by incoming waves. The caves, which depended on precise timing with the tides, became more difficult to enter safely. Still, the overall structure of the beach remained intact. By January, the situation had shifted more dramatically. Strong easterly winds began to dominate the region, altering not just the surface conditions, but the very movement of sediment along the coastline. Sand that had accumulated over months and years was now being transported away at a rapid pace. The process was not immediately visible in a single moment, but over days and weeks, its effects became undeniable. The beach grew steeper as material was stripped away. What had once been a gradual incline turned into a sharper drop toward the waterline. Waves, encountering less resistance from the diminished sand barrier, pushed further inland. The basalt columns and cliff bases, previously set back from the active surf, were now directly exposed to the full force of the ocean. Footage and images captured during this period showed waves striking the cliffs with increasing intensity, sending spray high into the air and leaving little room for safe passage along the shoreline. The sense of scale shifted. Features that once appeared distant and monumental were now crowded by the encroaching sea, compressing the entire landscape into a narrower, more volatile space. By February, access had become severely limited. In some areas, it was effectively impossible to reach the previously popular sections without encountering significant risk. The beach, in practical terms, had ceased to function as a beach at all. Instead, It resembled a collision zone between land and water, where the ocean maintained near constant contact with the base of the cliffs. Concerns began to extend beyond the immediate visual changes. The proximity of wave action to infrastructure, including nearby parking areas and access paths, raised questions about potential damage. The force of repeated impacts against the coastline highlighted the underlying vulnerability of the terrain, particularly during sustained periods of intense weather. To observers unfamiliar with coastal processes, the conclusion seemed straightforward. The beach had been washed away. The absence of sand, the altered slope, and the relentless presence of waves all pointed toward a permanent loss. Social media amplified this perception, with posts describing the location as having disappeared or been consumed by the sea. Yet beneath these surface impressions, a more intricate sequence of events was taking place, governed by the interaction of wind, waves, and sediment. The key to understanding the transformation lay not in a single storm or isolated incident, but in the cumulative effect of directional forces acting over time. Along this stretch of coastline, the supply of sand originates from nearby glacial outwash plains. The meltwater rivers carry fine volcanic material from inland sources and deposit it along the shore. This sediment does not remain fixed in place. Instead, it is constantly redistributed by wave action in a process that moves material laterally along the coast. When waves approach the shoreline at an angle, they push sand diagonally up the beach. Gravity then pulls the material straight back down, creating a repeating zigzag motion that gradually shifts sediment from one location to another. The direction and intensity of this movement depend heavily on prevailing wind patterns, which influence the angle and energy of incoming waves. During the period dominated by easterly winds, wave energy was directed in such a way that sand was carried away from the affected area. The beach did not vanish into deeper water, rather, it was relocated along the coastline, redistributed beyond its usual boundaries. The narrowing of the beach and the exposure of underlying features were direct results of this outward transport. Local geography further intensified the effect. A combination of offshore rock formations and the shape of the coastline created conditions that concentrated wave energy. Instead of dispersing evenly, incoming waves were funneled towards specific sections, increasing their erosive capacity. With less sand available to absorb and dissipate this energy, the rate of change accelerated. By late February, the cumulative impact of these factors had reached its peak. The beach, as it had been known, was effectively absent from view. What remained was a stark demonstration of coastal power, where the distinction between land and sea blurred under continuous pressure. Then, as conditions shifted once more, a reversal began to take shape. In early March, the dominant wind direction changed. Westerly winds replaced the easterly pattern that had driven the initial erosion. This alteration, subtle in its onset but significant in its consequences, began to influence the movement of sediment along the shore in the opposite direction. Waves, now approaching from a different angle, started to carry sand back toward the previously depleted area. The same zigzag motion that had removed material was now working to restore it. Grain by grain, layer by layer, the beach began to rebuild. At first, the changes were difficult to detect without close observation. Slight accumulations appeared along the waterline, forming small ridges that hinted at a broader shift. Over successive days, these deposits grew, gradually extending the shoreline outward. Access points that had been cut off by relentless wave action started to re-emerge. The slope of the beach softened as new layers of sand settled into place. The basalt columns, once under constant assault from incoming waves, regained a measure of separation from the surf. The caves, though still subject to tidal conditions, became reachable once again during calmer periods. The transformation did not occur instantly, nor did it restore the landscape to its exact previous state. Coastal systems rarely return to a fixed baseline. Instead, they evolve continuously, shaped by the balance of forces acting upon them. What emerged in the wake of this cycle was not a perfect reconstruction, but a reconfiguration, one that reflected the recent history of erosion and deposition. The apparent disappearance of the beach, then, was not the result of a singular catastrophic event, nor a permanent loss. It was a phase within an ongoing process driven by the dynamic interplay of natural elements. The sand had not been destroyed, it had been displaced. The shoreline had not been erased, it had been temporarily redefined. For those encountering the scene at its most extreme point, the experience remained striking. The absence of familiar features and the dominance of the ocean created an impression of sudden and irreversible change. Yet the subsequent return of the beach, even in partial form, revealed the underlying resilience of the system. What had seemed like a vanishing act was in reality a redistribution. What appeared to be an endpoint was, in fact, a transition, and as the shoreline continued to adjust under shifting winds and waves, the event stood as a reminder that even the most iconic landscapes are not fixed in time, but are constantly shaped by forces that operate beyond immediate perception, forces capable of removing, reshaping, and restoring entire environments within the span of a single season. As the shoreline continued to rebuild through early March, the gradual return of sand began to reshape not only the physical landscape, but also the understanding of what had taken place. What had been widely perceived as a sudden and alarming disappearance started to resolve into a pattern, one that, while dramatic in appearance, followed a set of natural processes that had been operating along this coast for far longer than any single season. The newly deposited layers of sand did not arrive evenly. Instead, they formed in irregular bands, creating subtle ridges and depressions that shifted daily depending on wave conditions. In some sections, the beach extended outward by several meters, while in others it remained narrow, with waves still reaching close to the cliffs. This uneven recovery reflected the same forces that had driven the erosion, now acting in reverse but with varying intensity across the shoreline. The basalt columns, which had been nearly surrounded by water during the peak of the erosion phase, gradually regained a buffer of sand at their base. This buffer, though thinner than before, altered how waves interacted with the rock formations. Instead of striking directly with full force, incoming waves began to break earlier, dissipating some of their energy before reaching the cliffs. The visual difference was immediate: less spray, reduced vertical impact, and a clearer separation between land and sea. The caves, which had become inaccessible during the height of the changes, reappeared as the beach widened. Their entrances, once submerged or cut off by steep, unstable slopes, became reachable again under specific tidal conditions. However, the contours of these openings had shifted slightly. Wave action during the erosion phase had modified their edges, smoothing some areas while deepening others. These changes, though subtle, indicated that, even as the beach returned, it did not do so without leaving a trace of what had occurred. Further along the shoreline, scattered stones and larger fragments of rock became more visible as the sand redistributed itself. Some of these materials had been buried beneath the previous surface, only to be exposed when the upper layers were stripped away. As new sand settled, portions of these rocks were covered again, creating a constantly changing mosaic that reflected the ongoing movement beneath the surface. The role of wind direction remained central to these developments. With westerly winds prevailing, waves approached the coast at a different angle, carrying sediment back toward the area that had been depleted. This shift did not simply replace what had been lost, it rebalanced the distribution along the entire stretch of coastline. Sand that had accumulated further west during the earlier phase was now being transported back, effectively reversing the previous flow. This back-and-forth movement of material is a defining characteristic of such coastal environments. Rather than existing in a fixed state, the shoreline operates as part of a larger system in which sediment is continuously exchanged between different sections. At any given time, one area may experience erosion while another gains material. Over longer periods, these changes can appear cyclical, though they are influenced by a wide range of variables including seasonal weather patterns, storm frequency, and variations in sediment supply. The glacial outwash plains that feed this coastline continued to play a crucial role in the process. Meltwater rivers, carrying fine volcanic particles from inland regions, deposited fresh material along the shore. While this input is not constant, it provides a source of replenishment that contributes to the beach's ability to recover after periods of loss. Without this supply, the effects of erosion would be more difficult to reverse, and the balance between removal and deposition would shift. Local geographical features also remained a significant factor. The offshore rock pillars and the shape of the coastline influenced how wave energy was distributed. During the erosion phase, these features had acted to concentrate wave force in specific areas, accelerating the removal of sand. As conditions changed, they continued to affect how incoming waves deposited material, guiding the formation of new sandbanks and altering the contours of the shoreline. By mid-March, the beach had reached a state that, while not identical to its earlier form, was once again recognizable. Visitors returning to the area found that access had largely been restored. The wide expanse of black sand, though still evolving, provided sufficient space for movement along the shore. The basalt columns stood once more as a central feature, and the caves could be approached under favorable conditions. Despite this apparent recovery, the events of the preceding months left a lasting impression. The rapid transformation from a broad, stable beach to a narrow, wave-dominated edge, and back again, highlighted the speed at which such environments can change. It also underscored the importance of viewing these landscapes not as static attractions, but as active systems shaped by forces that operate on multiple timescales. The perception that the beach had disappeared can be traced to the timing and visibility of these changes. For those arriving during the peak of the erosion phase, the absence of sand was both immediate and striking. Without an understanding of the underlying processes, it was reasonable to interpret this as a permanent loss. The visual evidence supported that conclusion: waves where there had been land, cliffs exposed where there had been distance, and familiar features rendered inaccessible. However, the subsequent return of the sand revealed the temporary nature of this state. The beach had not been removed from existence, but had instead shifted position within the broader coastal system. Its apparent absence was a matter of redistribution rather than destruction. This distinction becomes clearer when considering the mechanics of longshore drift. The zigzag movement of sediment along the coast ensures that material is rarely lost entirely from the system. Instead, it is relocated, sometimes over considerable distances, before being redeposited under different conditions. The direction of this movement is closely tied to wind patterns, which can change over relatively short periods, leading to equally rapid shifts in the distribution of sand. The events observed over the winter months represent an intensified example of this process. Strong, sustained winds amplified the usual movement of sediment, producing changes that were both faster and more visible than those occurring under calmer conditions. The result was a temporary imbalance in which removal outpaced deposition until the prevailing forces shifted once again. As the beach continued to adjust in the weeks that followed, smaller fluctuations remained evident. Sections would expand and contract with changing tides and wind conditions, and the exact position of the shoreline shifted subtly from day to day. These variations, though less dramatic, were part of the same system that had produced the earlier extremes. Seen in its entirety, the sequence offers a clear demonstration of how coastal landscapes function. They are not fixed boundaries, but moving interfaces, constantly shaped and reshaped by the elements. The events along this stretch of Iceland's southern coast serve as a precise example of this principle, showing how quickly and completely a familiar environment can change, and how, given the right conditions, it can return. The black sand, the basalt formations, and the ever-present waves remain part of the same system, bound together by processes that operate whether observed or not. What changed was their arrangement, temporarily altered by a shift in conditions before being set back into motion once again. And with that, the question that first captured attention finds its answer not in disappearance, but in movement, measured not in loss, but in transition. If you found this eye-opening, don't keep it to yourself. Hit like, share this with others, and subscribe for more in-depth stories like this. And don't forget to tap that hype icon to help this video reach a wider audience. Your support makes a huge difference.